that are not residents, always are residents. We welcome you. But it's so nice of you to come out to see Dr. Crane. He does hold a big crowd. So we just are in part 4 of our 6-part series this evening. And let's just welcome him and let him do his thing. Yay.
Thank you. Good to be back. And we were talking last week in terms of the Korean War, and stressing in terms of in Q&A before we get in, we were stressing here in the aftermath of World War II. There was this hope that this great watershed, especially after World War I, which took the lives of 15 million people, World War II took the lives of 62 million people, but that's actually here a conservative estimate. Some estimates go as high as 80 million. And the majority of them were in fact civilians. And a question came last week in terms of, since remember I was saying that the United States lost 410,000 lives in World War II, Britain lost 454,000 lives. The Soviet Union lost close to 30 million lives. So they suffered to the high heavens. And not just in terms of this massive loss of life and very high casualty rate, but also suffering $464 billion worth of damage here to Soviet Union, primarily Russia, but also Ukraine, two of the most prominent Soviet republics at that time. And the question came up in terms of how many Germans, Japanese, about 5.3 million Germans died in World War II, about 3.1 million Japanese. So you have here very high death tolls, no doubt about it. It's the second most destructive event in all of American history with 410,000 dead, and that's for both theaters, both the Pacific and the European theater. Second only to the American Civil War. But you see here, by the same end, the United States, as we stressed in our opening salvo, is the only nation to, in fact, effectively remove, or I should say emerge, from World War II virtually unscathed. Not to make light of the tremendous loss of life on the part of the Americans, but by the same end, whether you're talking the victorious Allied side or the defeated Axis power side, really the Americans have the good fortune here, as we have talked about, 6% of the world's population controlling 63% of the world's industry and 75% of the world's capital. Holy mackerel, that's some domination, no doubt about that here in the aftermath of that war. Well, we shifted our attention as we were looking here over the course of the past couple of weeks in terms of the origins of the Cold War. And we stressed the fact that with the Truman Doctrine in 1947, formally passed by, or introduced, I should say, by Harry Truman, in March of that time period, you have March 12th of 1947, Harry Truman is going to stress that the United States will defend any nation anywhere in the world that is opposed to communism. So you're going to have much more of an interventionist approach on the part of the U.S. The U.S. recognizes, privately, Harry Truman knows the Americans have this massive lead. But by the same end, it's like we have this massive lead. We are an economic and a military superpower. Let's keep this massive lead. And the Soviets cannot compete with the Americans economically. Dear God, no, not even close. But they can compete militarily. They can compete here militarily. We witnessed the Cold War effectively heating up. Well, we stress the fact that with the Korean War, here as communist North Korea in June of 1950 is going to launch an all-out invasion of capitalist South Korea, that from the standpoint of Truman and the Americans, this is of vital U.S. interest. I'm not saying it is or isn't. I'm saying this is what the approach was on the part of Truman. And he's going to call here Douglas MacArthur, who is overseeing the occupation of the island nation of Japan, which still as a nation is under direct military authority of the United States, to see if the goal here was to reestablish the 38th parallel. Well, MacArthur, as we saw last week, is going to do that with astounding ease. It is his finest hour, no doubt about that. This offensive here, Busan, Incheon especially, holy mackerel. It really is going to take the North Korean army and utterly destroy it in a matter of about 72 hours. And MacArthur, as we know then from last time as well, at the conclusion, wanted to invade across the 38th parallel. The North Korean communists, after all, had started it. Cross over the 38th parallel and take down historic communist North Korea and unify this entire Korean peninsula under the leadership of Syngman Rhee, a capitalist. Well, Harry Truman hesitates because he's worried about the Chinese getting involved in this war. The last thing he wants is a large war. Well, MacArthur convinces him, that in this situation it will work. It will work. He has all the confidence in the world. So he's given the green light by the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, Harry Truman. And here in October of 1950, the U.S. and UN forces, as well as the South Korean forces, are going to launch an invasion of North Korea. Well, just as Harry Truman feared, on November 1st, 1950, the Chinese communists are going to come pouring into North Korea across the Yalu River. And they will literally hear me driving because they're outnumbering the US and UN forces 10 to 1. Drive these forces all the way deep back into South Korea. We've got a whole new war here in 1950. Well, the problem fundamentally is that MacArthur is not going to accept any responsibility for this. Instead, what he's going to do publicly is he's going to tell the American population that this war would already have been victorious if the President of the United States had not tied my hands. Well, this simply was not true. Far from it. And the stress here over the course of November of 1950 and onwards into early December was very, very difficult for Harry Truman, difficult for a lot of people in many, many situations. So for Truman, and from his perspective, here on December 5th of 1950, the situation went from bad to worse. It's very, very personal. And Charlie Ross, who had been a longtime boyhood friend of his, going all the way back in Independence, they'd been kindergarten classmates. Charlie Ross was his press secretary, and Charlie Ross is going to follow her dead of a heart attack. That same evening, Harry Truman is to go to Constitution Hall with his wife Bess to hear their only child, their daughter Margaret, sing. Now, Margaret Truman had always had these aspirations of becoming a professional singer, and she was a pretty good singer for all intents and purposes. But as far as many music critics were concerned, the only reason she's in Constitution Hall is because she happens to be the president's daughter. Well, this evening here, December 5th, 1950, a music critic from the Washington Post is in the audience by the name of Paul Hume. And what Paul Hume does that evening after the concert is he writes a pretty scathing review of Harry Truman's daughter. Stated the following: Miss Truman is a unique American phenomenon with a pleasant voice, of little size and fair quality. She is attractive on stage, yet there are few moments during her recital when one can actually relax and feel confident that she will make it to her goal, which is the end of the song. She is flat a good deal of the time. She cannot sing with anything approaching professional finish. She communicates almost nothing of the music she presents. It is an extremely unpleasant duty to record such unhappy facts about so honestly appealing a person. But as long as Miss Truman sings, as she does, we seem to have no recourse, unless it is to omit comment on her programs altogether. Well, 4 a.m. the next morning, Harry Truman here sees this. He sees this write-up on his daughter. Now, do you ever have this situation, you get really angry? Will Rogers, American satirist, summed it up best. Those who fly into rages always make bad landings. Very true. So you're in this situation, you're completely livid with somebody, and you're going to write that letter. And what you need to do with that nasty letter is you need to, 19 out of 20 times, scroll it up and throw it away. Or that email, the same thing. Don't hit send. Whatever you do, don't hit send. You'll end up regretting it. Well, Charlie Ross, if he had been there, would have said to Harry Truman here in December of 1950, okay, you can't send this letter that you just wrote. You can't do this. Charlie Ross, of course, is no longer there. Harry Truman is going to write the following letter to Mr. Hume. Mr. Hume, I've just read your lousy review of Margaret's concert. I've come to the conclusion that you are an 8-ulcer man on 4-ulcer pay. It seems to me that you are a frustrated old man. Actually, Mr. Hume is 38 years old for the record. A frustrated old man who wishes he could have been successful. When you write such poppycock as was in the back section of the paper you work for, it shows conclusively that you're off the beam, and at least 4 of your ulcers are at work. Someday I hope to meet you. When that happens, you'll need a new nose, a lot of beef stick for black eyes, and a supporter down below. Signed, HST. Well, what does Paul Hume do? When he gets this letter, he gives it to the editor of the Washington Post, and the Washington Post said, editor said, great, let's put this on the front page tomorrow. So now it's broadcast across the entire nation. Of what not to do 101, this was Harry Truman. He definitely would regret this. Consider it his biggest mistake ever. And what happened and what really hit home, when all was said and done, is he received, just before Christmas of 1950, a letter from William Banning. And William Banning's son had been killed here as an American soldier in Korea just a few weeks before. And in this letter that he wrote to Harry Truman, William Banning enclosed the Purple Heart that his son had earned on the battlefield. Stated the following: Mr. Truman, as you have been directly responsible for the loss of our son's life in Korea, you might as well keep this emblem on display in your trophy room as a memory of one of your many historic deeds. Our major regret at this time is that your daughter was not there to receive the same treatment as our son received in Korea. Signed, William Banning. For Harry Truman, what he did is he took this letter and he would keep it till the end of his life as a reminder here. It's not clear if he actually wrote Mr. Banning back, etc., but it was like, oh dear God, what did I do? Here we have this horrific war. We've got hundreds of American boys, thousands of them having died already. This war now, which has taken on a life of its own. And I'm off getting bent out of shape about my daughter's concert review. A difficult lesson, to say the least. Well, here, as we referenced, you have Harry Truman is going to see some hope coming forth from Matthew Ridgway. I want you to remember that this evening, Matthew Ridgway's name, because he's one of the more unheralded heroes in all of U.S. history, and for a number of reasons. And from Ridgway's perspective, when he implements Operation Ripper in the Korean War, he's going to drive the Chinese communists and the North Korean communists back up towards that 38th parallel, almost to the 38th parallel here by early January of 1951. Well, this was good news. It was good news. But by the same end, the situation here with Douglas MacArthur, who's overseeing the entire war effort from Tokyo, he's not on the ground here. He's not in the trenches like Ridgway is. I'm not saying that he should be or he shouldn't be, but he's directing it, overseeing it here from Japan. From MacArthur's perspective here, he is not going to let this go. He is not going to take the blame here for the Chinese intervention. And by the same end, he is demanding publicly, and he had already been told by Harry Truman, not another word out of you, that what he has to have, what needs to happen now, is for the United States to launch an all-out strike on China, using our weapon superiority, meaning in essence nuclear weapons. By the same end, we need to unleash Chiang Kai-shek's army here as well on the Chinese. Harry Truman knows that what the Americans have at this time, it's a peacekeeping force. World War II just ended 5 years before and 62 million dead. The last thing he wants is another massive war, especially when the focus for the Americans in this Cold War is Europe, not Asia. Not Asia. Certainly Asia is a part of it, there's no doubt about that. But by the same end here, this is something that would be a huge mistake as far as Truman is concerned. Again, he tells Douglas MacArthur, not another word out of you. Well, MacArthur doesn't stop. And this continues on here over the course of January into February of 1951. Well, for Harry Truman, he's not exactly sure what to do. What he's looking for here is for this Operation Ripper that had been run through the, actually had done very, very well in terms of driving the Chinese communists and the North Korean communists back up along the 38th parallel, the DMZ, or the demilitarized zone, where the fighting is going to continue over the course of 1951 and beyond. By the same end here, he is getting consistent flack from Douglas MacArthur. And the American population sees MacArthur as this huge hero. And Harry Truman, his approval rating, it's about 32% at this time period. Well, what happens? What happens is, time and time again here, he'd been telling MacArthur, enough. Enough is enough. And finally, Matthew Ridgway here, who is at the White House, is going to say to General Hoyt Vandenberg, why is MacArthur able to get away with this? You can fire him, can't you? You have to fire him. And what MacArthur is now stating in March of 1951 is that the Joint Chiefs of Staff, they're the military specialists, that they support his policy of an expanded war. Well, again, Harry Truman, for the 5th time, tells Douglas Douglas MacArthur, anything you have to say publicly, anything you need to say publicly, you have to have it cleared by the White House first. Well, what MacArthur does is he writes a letter. He writes a letter to the House Republican leader, Joseph Martin. And Truman really wanted to fire him, but he wanted to see here one final step that was just going completely above and beyond in terms of ridiculousness. And in this letter, which Joseph Martin read on the floor of the House of Representatives, MacArthur stated the following: "The United States must be in Korea to win this war. If not, the Truman administration should be indicted for the murder of our American boys." End quote. That did it. That did it. As far here as Truman was concerned, you're done. On April 11th, 1951, this war hero, Douglas MacArthur, who had not been in the United States, back to the United States since 1933, is now going to be coming home. He's been effectively fired. Well, Gallup poll at this time indicated 78% of Americans sided with General MacArthur. 27,000 telegrams would flood here into the White House over the course of the next week. And of those 27,000, out of every 20 of them, only one was supportive of Harry Truman. The other 19 were all supportive of Douglas MacArthur. Harry Truman's presidential approval rating is going to drop to 14%, an all-time presidential low. Well, from the standpoint here of MacArthur, he's going to come back home to this ticker tape parade, to this hero's welcome. He will address a joint session of Congress, and he will give here a joint session of Congress that is interrupted by literally 16 standing ovations. And he will give, at the end of this, his old soldier's speech, is what it becomes known as. Old soldiers never die, they just fade away. Well, for the Republicans, they were considering here drafting him on the ticket for November of 1952. He'd be fantastic. Absolutely fantastic. But for as much hostility as it was towards Harry Truman, 14% approval rating, that's not good. By the same end, it also faded away. MacArthur faded away in terms of his overall prominence. And the reason being is that newspapers here over the spring and summer of 1951 pointed out that first and foremost, Harry Truman is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, and Douglas MacArthur wasn't listening in any way, shape, or form. Furthermore, secondly, you have the Joint Chiefs of Staff coming forth, led by Omar Bradley, a World War II hero in the European theater, and Omar Bradley's point was, we never approved of MacArthur's plan. Not in any way, shape, or form. Not one of us. He's lying. Plain and simple. He made that up. Not one of the 6 of us ever said this was a good idea to expand the war into China. And by the same end here, Bradley went on saying that this would be the wrong war in the wrong place for the wrong reasons. Well, here, for MacArthur, indeed, just as rapidly as this star just completely and totally ascended, it's also going to decline. And as time progresses here, he would fade away, just as said. Harry Truman was asked years later if he had any regrets. As President of the United States, Truman said, no, not one. So what about the firing of Douglas MacArthur? He said, yeah, I have one regret there, and that my one regret is that I didn't fire his ass a lot sooner. Harry Truman, in this situation, here, from his perspective, is confident that history would be kind to him, would be very, very kind to him. He wasn't interested in popularity contests. What he was interested here was in doing the right thing, going back to his life, living on the farms, as a Midwestern farm boy outside of Independence, Missouri, where he was taught these values of never get too big for your britches, trust in God, never forget a friend. And in this case, it kept him here very grounded, very humble, all the way through his White House years. So you have an individual that now presidential historians generally rank him as the 6th best president in all of U.S. history. He's someone whose star continues to rise. David McCullough's biography, it's entitled simply Truman, in my opinion, is the best historical biography I've ever read in my life. Wherever Harry Truman is, Now David McCullough has also passed away. But wherever Harry Truman is, he owes a tremendous debt of gratitude to David McCullough, because what he does is he really gets at the heart of the matter, that he was a good and decent human being. Well, for Truman, one thing was for sure. The Korean War is continuing. They're fighting along the 38th parallel. As 1952 begins, he's not going to run for re-election. Technically, he could. Technically, he could. But he decides enough is enough. His approval rating here is never going to get above 26% for the remainder of his term as President of the United States. And what he's trying to do as this war is continuing, is he's trying to draft his replacement. And the one person Truman thinks the absolute world of at this stage is Dwight Eisenhower. Now, Eisenhower is in many ways comparable to Truman. He's got a bit of a nasty temper on him, no doubt about that. But by the same end here, he is also somebody who is not impressed with Dwight Eisenhower. He likes to fly under the radar, so to speak. An unsung hero, unbelievably brilliant guy, no doubt about it. And from Eisenhower's standpoint, he too is a Midwesterner. He was born originally in Denison, Texas. His mother and father both had four-year college degrees here in the late 19th century, which was very atypical, and nevertheless, the family was poor. The family here was in fact poor. His parents were completely and utterly opposed to violence, to war. They're pacifists, they're devoutly religious, and they are going to raise here a total of 7 boys. And Dwight Eisenhower will be the third of the 7. He will be the third of the 7. When he's just 4 years of age, 4 years of age before the whole brood has effectively arrived, the family's going to move to Abilene, Kansas, where they would work here, live on a farm, and they were pretty poor. No doubt about it. And in this situation, the 7 boys, they all got along great their entire lives, and they all went by the nickname of Ike. There was Tall Ike, there was Short Ike, there was Little Ike, not to be confused with Short Ike. There was Smart Ike, there was Ugly Ike. How'd you like to have it be the boy named Ugly Ike? Hey, Ugly Ike, come on over here. How you doing? Good, doing great. So in this case here, the parents are going to be able to scrape together enough money to save here for the 2 older boys to attend the University of Michigan for college. But when it comes time for Dwight Eisenhower here graduating from Abilene High, there's no more money. So he's going to go off and work for a year, but one of his best friends from his childhood onwards throughout his entire life is a gentleman by the name of Swede Hazlitt. And Swede Hazlitt had attended here boarding school at St. John's Military Academy in Delafield. His family was very, very well off. And when he found out that Dwight Eisenhower wasn't going to, his good friend Dwight wasn't going to even think about college, was going to save up and may not even attend, he said, why don't you do what I did? He said, I applied to both Annapolis, to the Naval Academy, as well as West Point. There you don't have to pay tuition. Why don't you do that? Well, his parents here are totally anti-war, so this would be a bit risque. But Eisenhower thought, well, what do I have to lose? So he took the entrance exam to both West Point and Annapolis, and he ended up finishing with the 2nd highest score. And now he's going to decide to go to West Point. And his parents were just like horrified when they found out that our son, our boy, our 3rd born, is going to become a lifetime military man. Oh dear God, what did we do wrong? How did we fail? And as the train is pulling out from Abilene, they're standing there at the station, both of them sobbing. Well, Dwight Eisenhower is going to go on to West Point. He would do okay as an undergraduate. He would do much better as he continued on to graduate school here and the graduate courses in Fort Leavenworth, where he would be 2nd in his class of 130 at that time. What he has in terms of his brilliance is this incredible ability to see the big picture, to see here the big picture. And it would be George Marshall, who we introduced here earlier on in the Cold War, General Marshall, tremendously honorable figure, who is going to recognize the brilliance of this rising star in the U.S. Army. Well, Eisenhower, in terms of the image that he puts forth, is of somebody who's more in 1952, more this like grandfather type, who is really not interested in being president. I mean, the Democrats were trying to get him, the Republicans were trying to get him. Finally, he tells Harry Truman, I'm a Republican, but I'm not going to run for president, but then he decides to anyway. And it's a sense of more or less doing his duty, as not really interested in it. The reality here is this guy is a workaholic. And you have here an individual who is the mastermind behind the largest amphibious landing in all of global history up to and including the present day. The Normandy invasion, D-Day, June 6, 1944. He was a chain smoker. He smoked 4 packs of cigarettes a day at this time. It was just at the time going into D-Day, his biggest concern was that what happens if the American, the British, and the French soldiers are all thrown right back into the ocean? What are we going to do? The Germans are deeply embedded. They knew it was coming. It was either there or Calais. It was the only 2 places these Allied landing could take place. And here in the longest day, eventually a foothold would be established, and the drive towards Paris and the liberation here of all of France would begin, marking the formal beginning of the end for Nazi Germany in the summer of 1944. Well, after World War II, he would be the first commander of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, this military alliance established by the United States against the Soviet Union in 1949. In 1950, he would become the president of Columbia University. Now, this was probably a mistake, because what happened here, his brother Milton, all of his brothers were super successful. His brother Milton was this nationally known educator. He was president at Penn State University at this time in Happy Valley, PA. And the belief was that they got to confuse the 2 brothers, and they sent this to Dwight Eisenhower in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, asking if he'd be interested in becoming president at Columbia University. He's like, yeah, that sounds great. I'm surprised they asked me, okay? So they get Dwight Eisenhower, and academics, it's just like an academic, I could summarize it best, Woodrow Wilson, Democrat from the state of New Jersey, who was a former president at Princeton University, was a history professor. He stated the following regarding academia. He said, the reason why academic infighting is so intense is because the stakes are so small. I agree 100%. Well, anyway, Dwight Eisenhower here, from the standpoint of Columbia, the faculty doesn't like him at all. How do we get stuck with this guy, this lightweight, etc.? And in this sense, for Eisenhower, from his perspective, Dwight Eisenhower wasn't going to take much personal at all. He didn't really care when all was said and done. And from the standpoint here, because of these 2 years at Columbia, it's going to come forth that he's not bright, which is utterly ridiculous. This guy is brilliant, absolutely brilliant. Well, anyway, 1952, he's going to run. He's going to be chosen here as a Republican candidate and decides to run for the White House against Adlai Stevenson, governor of the state of Illinois. And he will win here resoundingly. The Americans love this guy. Democrats and Republicans alike. And the attitude here is something when he leaves office in January of 1961, to be exact. What happens here is most presidential historians looked at this guy as kind of like a below average president. Somebody who liked to read Westerns and take naps and play golf and wasn't really interested in being president. And in fairness to the historians, this is the impression that Dwight Eisenhower gave out. But behind the scenes, holy mackerel, this guy was a workaholic to the high heavens, unbelievably focused. When he leaves the White House here, he's in the bottom third of presidents, just 1 step above Chester Arthur. We could do a 6-part biography on Chester Arthur. It probably would put us all to sleep, myself included. But it's not all that impressive by any means. But what happens here is he's someone whose star continues to rise as the dust settles and more information comes forth from the cabinet, etc. And he is viewed now by most presidential historians as the 6th or 7th best president in all of U.S. history. I would agree. It's a 1-2 punch. I did a biographical series on these guys 2 years ago, probably about 12 years ago. It was the men who changed America, Harry Truman and Dwight Eisenhower, 2 very, very incredibly impressive men, no doubt about it. Well, here for Eisenhower, when he becomes president, he's very optimistic. He's very optimistic because one of the first things he will do is on July 27th, 1953, he'll get a formal armistice signed in the Korean War. So the Korean War is a victory. It's a victory. The goal, the hope, the focus, the objective was to reestablish the 38th parallel. That has been achieved. No doubt about it. By the same end here, you've got communist North Korea is going to continue indefinitely, capitalist South Korea, it's what you have in the present day. You got the DMZ line instead of that straight line of the 38th parallel. But victory has been achieved. By the same end, Dwight Eisenhower is going to go after Joe McCarthy. And he will silence here this junior senator from the state of Wisconsin. The classic example, and what really makes it personal, is Joe McCarthy here begins to think he's above it all. And he begins to think furthermore in 1952 that Dwight Eisenhower here owes his victory at the election to Joe McCarthy. And it's absurd, it's ridiculous, 100%. And that Eisenhower didn't show the proper respect towards a junior senator from Wisconsin. And in this situation here, what Eisenhower is telling his Vice President Richard Nixon to do is go tell Joe McCarthy, tone it down, we don't need it anymore. Enough's enough. He hasn't found any communists. This campaign began on February 9th, 1950. It is now 53, and enough's enough. He's a Republican, I'm a Republican, no longer needed. As far as McCarthy is concerned, he is not going to in any way, shape, or form. Are you kidding me? Certainly not. And it sets the two men on a crash course, but what Eisenhower is not going to do is take on Joe McCarthy publicly. He said, I'm not going to do that because what he would love here, this demagogue, is he would love for me to get right into the mud with him. And I'm not doing that. That's way below me. Well, what McCarthy decides to do in early 1954 is to go after the heart and soul. It's a jab, clearly, at Dwight Eisenhower, the U.S. Army. And here, with this attack on the U.S. Army, here you've got Dwight Eisenhower, who has already put it in his will years before that when I die, I want to be buried in my Army fatigues. And now McCarthy is off here, the senator from Appleton, Wisconsin, is off talking about communists in the upper echelon of the United States Army. Are you kidding me? But as far as Eisenhower is concerned now, leading into the Army McCarthy hearings, it's time to destroy him once and for all. And not just bring an end to McCarthyism, which Eisenhower referred to as McCarthyism, but also to destroy him politically once and for all. That is exactly what's going to happen by the end of 1954, December 2nd. Joseph McCarthy is going to be censored, condemned here for behavior unbecoming of a U.S. senator. From there on, he's on this pathway of heavy drinking. He already had a problem with alcohol. He dies of alcoholism in May of 1957 at the age of just 48. Well, McCarthy here has been silenced. By the same end here for Eisenhower, the economy was booming. The economy in the 1940s, holy mackerel, we talked about that in 1945. 1950s, it's doing better. Now, obviously, in capitalist societies, you have recessions. You have these surges, you have these declines, back and forth, like the pendulum swinging back and forth. You want to ride those good times for as long as possible. There are a couple of recessions in the 1950s, but by and large, the situation is very, very strong for the nation. The 1960s are going to be the best of the best of the best decades of all in U.S. history, up to and including the present day. Now, you don't think about that when you think about Vietnam and the civil rights movement, etc., but you have here in the 1960s the most prosperous of all. The automobile industry is going to be taking on here an entirely new life in the 1950s, as too is the case with the housing industry. And this is necessary because you've got these baby boomers, oh dear God. From 1945, those Americans born in 1964, the cry heard across the nation is just going to soar, absolutely soar to the high heavens. And you have here this attitude coming forward from the baby boomers, their parents, the silent generation tied with the Eisenhower years. By the same end, they're also here as they're at adulthood, but more insignificant than that, even before the greatest generation. You're talking a generation, the greatest generation in particular, that lived through the heart and soul of the Great Depression. And then World War II. And the way that they lived their lives, they knew tough times. Holy mackerel, no doubt about that. The boomers? No, God, no. The sky was the limit. The sky here was the limit. The good times are going to keep on rolling. And in fairness to the boomers, my older brothers and sisters were all boomers. I'm a Gen Xer, I'm not exactly sure what that means. But I'm effectively not a boomer. But in this case here, for the baby boomers, it was a sense that the good times are just going to keep going. They had these grand expectations, and the way that their parents lived their lives in a very, very conservative fashion, thinking about, okay, well, let's just get through day to day. The boomers, by comparison, very, very different. Okay? It shows here the historical impact across the board. Well, for Dwight Eisenhower, one thing that he's concerned about, very concerned about, is this arms race between the Americans and the Soviets. And I had stressed that in 1950, the United States successfully tested its first hydrogen bomb during the Truman administration. That hydrogen bomb was 100 times more powerful than the combined atomic bombs that were dropped 5 years before on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In 1954, the United States here is going to do another hydrogen bomb, test another hydrogen bomb. This one was 750 times more powerful than the combined bombs that were dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We're talking here less than a decade. The Soviet Union, who successfully detonated their first atomic bomb in August of 1949, here in 1954, they will detonate their first hydrogen bomb as well. The arms race is going to start off. Now, for the Soviets here, it had already been going, but for the Soviet Union, it was more difficult. Because as a nation here, they're trying to dig themselves out of World War II, clean up the mess from that. It was a long, long time in coming, especially with a communist-style economy, a command economy. It's not as flexible. It's much more rigid. So it's going to take even longer. For the Americans here as well, and for Dwight Eisenhower, he's got to have the role, if you listen to him in public presentations as well, it's just like Harry Truman. You've got to be the Cold War warrior. You've got to be the Cold War warrior here across the board, stressing here the threat that we are experiencing. Behind the scenes, you may see things very, very different. The public image of Dwight Eisenhower was that of somebody who was much more of this laid-back guy who liked to take naps and play golf. But the reality, and he's in fairness, this is also the image he wants to give off. And he's going to delegate to the high heavens. John Foster Dulles is probably the best known of all secretaries of state in all of U.S. history. Why? Simple. Because Dwight Eisenhower here is going to give him a great deal of free play in terms of media attention, etc., newspapers, television, and so on and so forth. He's going to delegate to the high heavens. John Foster Dulles is following through exactly on what Dwight Eisenhower wants in terms of foreign policy, but he's always going to have that buffer zone. Well, it's going to make John Foster Dulles look like this great genius. I'm not saying that he was or he wasn't, but he'll do this time and time again, which will give the American people the impression that, well, he's just kind of overseeing things and he's not really all that interested. Well, when more and more documentation came forth, we know it's the exact opposite. John Foster Dulles' brother, Allen Dulles, there's a photograph of him. Allen Dulles is going to become here the director of the CIA. Now in 1947, Harry Truman is going to sign two acts or two pieces of legislation that he really didn't want to sign. One was for the NSC, the National Security Council, which directly advises the U.S. President on foreign policy. The other one is the CIA, or the Central Intelligence Agency. The problem with the CIA that Harry Truman had was we don't know how many people are in it. We don't know what its budget is. We have no idea what it's up to in the vast majority of cases. It could operate here as a state within a state. But Truman knew in 47, if I don't sign this into, basically, if I don't bring this into existence, it's a continuation of the OSS here from the Second World War of the United States, the Republicans are going to have a field day with me. And in fairness, if the roles were reversed, the Democrats would have had a field day with the Republican president, plain and simple. It's Cold War. Well, Allen Dulles here is going to be the director of the CIA, the younger brother of John Foster Dulles. And what Allen Dulles is looking for, because the United States is in peacekeeping forces, and of course now we're in the aftermath formally of the Korean War, what he's looking to do is to launch into covert operations. Covert operations. All nations spy on each other. This was true 100 years ago. It is true in the present day. The United States is not the exception. The United States is the norm. The CIA would be the equivalency here of the Soviet KGB. And what you have is the U.S. with this Truman Doctrine, which of course is also going to be followed by Dwight Eisenhower here in the Cold War, is closely monitoring here different areas from around the globe. And what you have in the nation of Iran in 1953 is you have this Iranian nationalist who comes to power. He is in essence the prime minister. His name is Mohammad Mossadegh. There's his photograph. And Mohammad Mossadegh has this grave concern as an Iranian nationalist. And his grave concern is the fact that the single largest corporation in the world at this time is the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, operating just outside of Tehran. And the AIOC, as it's known as here, it eventually becomes British Petroleum, BP. But what you have here is a sense that the British are receiving a tremendous amount of royalties, of money, etc., by drilling for and bringing forth this Iranian oil. And what Mossadegh is arguing here is that the British need to leave. The oil here in Iran is for the Iranian people, not for the British, not for the French and Aquitaine or whatever would be the case. Well, adding to this is the United States government, especially the CIA, is also concerned. It is also concerned not so much with Mohammad Mossadegh's National Front Party, which is the most prominent political party, but it's also concerned here about this Tudeh party. The Tudeh party is a Marxist party here in the nation of Iran. And the nation of Iran, furthermore, rests along the border, the southern border of the Soviet Union. So it's a concern here of what is going to happen, what is in fact going to formally unfold. Well, the CIA is closely monitoring matters, and Kermit Roosevelt here, who would be the grandson of the American President Theodore Roosevelt, he's working for the CIA. They're going to implement what's called Operation Ajax. What this means here is that Operation Ajax, the American CIA is going to join with supporters of the Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Shah, who sees himself as this descendant of the Pahlavi dynasty. He'd be much more sympathetic to British, to French, to U.S. economic interests, predominantly oil here in Iran. And they want to here overthrow Mohammad Mossadegh. Why? Because Mohammad Mossadegh is claiming that these refineries need to be sold, they need to be turned over to the Iranians, no longer here these international corporations, these international businesses. Well, on August 16th, 1953, Operation Ajax is launched. And what happens here is the CIA with supporters here of the Shah are going to go into action, and they're going to try and overthrow Mohammad Mossadegh. They fail. They fail. They report back to the White House, and back as well to Allen Dulles, asking if we could have one more opportunity to give this a shot. They came very, very close here in Tehran in August of 1953. They're given the green light for a second attempt, and exactly 72 hours later, Mohammad Mossadegh believed here that the storm had already passed. He was wrong. And on August 19th, 1953, he's going to be overthrown. He will be overthrown. He's a prominent Iranian nationalist. He is going to be placed under house arrest for the remainder of his life. He lives all the way until 1968. And what you have is now Mohammad Mossadegh. You will have here Mohammad Reza Shah, who is going to now assume power. And from his standpoint here, as far as he is concerned, he does not want to be overthrown in any way, shape, or form. And he's going to rule here Iran with this iron fist, with the secret police organization he has here, his secret armed forces, referred to as Savak. And will set up here this police state across the nation of Iran. So you have here the Shah, from the American perspective, kind of like a case of, yes, it was mission accomplished, but it was a sense here, the excuse, the concern was this Tudeh party might be linked with the Kremlin in Moscow. Well, that wasn't the case. The Tudeh party is going to be outlawed soon enough. But here, as far as the Iranian people are concerned, by the end of 1953, we're under the Shah's jurisdiction. This has become here this police state. And the Shah is nothing more than an American puppet. Nothing more than an American puppet. When we go decades later, as we talked about some series ago in the United States and the modern Middle East, you get to the Iranian Revolution, you wonder where all that hostility, all that anger was coming here towards the United States. A lot of it was because of the Shah. Tens of thousands of Iranian people are going to go missing, and the Shah is going to be swept here ultimately to the curb. It's the old adage of be careful what you wish for, because the Ayatollah Khomeini comes into power, of course, here decades later. At the time of this revolution, February 1st, 1979, the Ayatollah Khomeini makes the Shah of Iran, by comparison, look like Rebecca of Donnybrook Farm. And Rebecca of Donnybrook Farm, she was not known for being a violent person by any stretch. Well, by the same end, the CIA is going to get involved as well in Guatemala. United Fruit Company here, which is literally 80% of Guatemala at this time, is owned by United Fruit here in the early 1950s. And you have this gentleman, a gentleman by the name of Jacobo Arbenz. Jacobo Arbenz, let's see if I don't have a photograph of him, I thought I did, is going to institute here as a new leader of Guatemala land reform. And he wants to purchase here this land from United Fruit for the Guatemalan people. It's a very, very poor country here at this stage. Well, there's a concern here that Arbenz, as far as the CIA is worried, are looking at this, Jacobo Arbenz Guzman, his full name, that the CIA is worried that he is a Marxist. He is a Marxist, and now we're in the hemisphere of the United States. So he's got to go. And in 1954, a coup is launched to overthrow here this left wing. Was he a left wing Marxist? I'd say yeah, most likely. The evidence is pretty strong. But the CIA here, with supporters of the opposition, are going to overthrow Guzman, and you'll have set up here in Guatemala, with the help of the CIA, you will have a government that's much more conducive as far as the Americans are concerned. One of the problems in the Cold War for the United States in this hostility towards communism. And historically, communism is bad, no doubt about it. The evidence for that's overwhelming. But what happens here is in your hostility there in the Cold War, you end up supporting ultra-right-wing organizations as well that are just as bad, if not worse, both of which need to be avoided. Your good friend Tim, I've said it before, I'll say it again, you'll walk right down the middle of the road, and remember, those who walk in the middle of the road tend to get run over. Well, in this situation here, the United States is looking to stabilize the Middle East. They are following here an interventionist approach. And they're keeping the close eyes of all on Europe. Europe seems to be fairly stable, Central and Western Europe. The United States is establishing very close relationships here that took over a long time in coming. They seem solid over the course of this time period. And for the Americans and for the CIA, it's going around the globe, closely monitoring matters wherever it would be, in Africa, Southeast Asia, and reporting back. What you're trying to do is you're trying to stay a step ahead. You're trying here, in fact, to stay a step ahead. How all this is going to play out at this stage wasn't entirely clear. Well, from the framework here in Western Europe, West Germany as a nation, as we had stressed a couple of presentations before, effectively comes into being. Konrad Adenauer is going to be this prominent prime minister here of West Germany. It represents 80% of historic Germany here at the end of World War II, established by the British, the French, and the Americans in the aftermath of the Second World War. And what the Germans are going to do here, West Germany, is they're going to reach out to France. They're going to reach out to France and they'll set up the Schuman Plan. Europe is going to learn from the horrors of the wars, having experienced both World War I and World War II. It'll become a much more stabilized area across the board for these nations moving forward. This extreme nationalism that had come to the surface in Europe, particularly in Central and Western Europe, was not good. It wasn't healthy. It led here to World War I, to World War II. Most historians aren't even seeing those wars as two separate entities anymore. They're seeing them rather as one war with a 20-year truce in between. I'd say that's pretty accurate, too, in terms of an overall assessment. Well, by the same end here with the Schuman Plan, the West Germans and the French are going to coordinate in terms of commonality, whether it be coal, electricity, etc. Could save both these nations a great deal of money. They're closely allied with the United States, very, very close indeed. Charles de Gaulle could be challenging at times for the Americans. But what the Europeans were doing is they're standing strong with the Americans, and they're also trying to intertwine themselves a great deal, which would lead to the EEC, or what is in the present day the European Common Market. Not anywhere near as close historically in terms of economic prominence as the United States. But by the same end here, Western Europe is going to rebound in a very, very significant fashion and be very closely tied to the United States in the decades that in fact formally followed. Well, for the Soviet Union. For the Soviet Union here, you have all sorts of challenges in the 1950s. First and foremost, in terms of agricultural production, it was in a continual and eternal slump. These collective farms weren't working. It was a sense here of what to do, how to pull out of this, was anyone's guess. It was a very, very closed society across the board. and a great fear of outsiders. It was very, very difficult to get into this place, even at this time, during this time period of Joseph Stalin. Joseph Stalin was just as paranoid as ever. As I've referenced before, the two most evil people to grace planet Earth in 5,000 years of recorded history, Joseph Stalin and Adolf Hitler. One from the extreme left wing, one from the extreme right wing. Well, the problem here for the Soviets is that Joseph Stalin is going to be dominating this nation from 1925 all the way until his death in 1953. And what you have here is individuals who are going to challenge him. Marshal Zhukov, this World War II hero. What happens is Stalin gets very jealous of him. And Stalin is going to send him off to Odessa. It's very surprising that he didn't have a purge and formally get rid of Zhukov as well. He's responsible here, Joseph Stalin, for the deaths of tens of millions of his own people. This isn't propaganda, this is reality. And the evidence for that, especially with the opening of the Kremlin archives, is quite dead on in many, many cases. Took more lives, far more lives, it's argued, than what happened, what Germany was responsible for in World War II. Well, Joseph Broz Tito, you can see here on our map, if you look down in white, you can see Yugoslavia. In the aftermath of World War I, Yugoslavia is formally established at the Paris Peace Conference. And it was it was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire from World War I. It's like this mishmash of Serbs and Croats and Macedonians and Bosnians. And the issue became one of what do we do? How do we set all this up? Well, what they end up doing here is creating across the Adriatic from Italy, they create this new nation, this nation of Yugoslavia. And the majority of the population are the Serbs. So the Serbs here are going to come to power. In the aftermath of World War II, as far as Joseph Stalin was concerned, of course, Yugoslavia is going to be part of the Eastern Bloc that the Soviets here are in fact going to control. And in Yugoslavia, Joseph Broz Tito is the new communist leader. Now, from Tito's perspective, what he is looking at is basically here, as the Cold War starts heating up, he doesn't want to be a satellite of the Kremlin in Moscow. Not in any way, shape, or form. He's a communist, and he's an avowed communist. He doesn't need Stalin to tell him that. But as far as he is concerned, he wants for Yugoslavia communism at its own pace. Here in 1948. And he's going to announce that. He's going to announce it as well. Well, from Stalin's perspective, here, these nations, all shaded in orange, they were all part of the Comintern. So what the Soviet Union would do is basically tell all of them what they were going to be doing, both in terms of anything with foreign policy, but especially domestic policy, and these command economies, the detailed planning that went into it. Well, Joseph Broz Tito, the communist leader of Yugoslavia, wanted nothing to do with that. Joseph Stalin, therefore, is going to state publicly the following: I will shake my little finger and there will be no more Tito. Well, the situation here is, what are you going to do about Tito? You're a hardline communist leader. He's a communist leader as well. He's not claiming he's not going to be a communist. And you've got an issue with this. He does. And what Stalin is going to do to up the ante is he's going to throw Yugoslavia out of Comintern. Throw them to the wolves. Nobody's going to have anything to do here of these other orange states with Yugoslavia. They're no longer part of Comintern. Well, for Yugoslavia, this isn't good, because this is going to be here the ultimate economic retribution. They can't survive without their fellow East European communist states, especially the Soviet Union. Enter the United States. From the American perspective here, what the U.S. is going to start doing is it's going to start sending aid to Yugoslavia, this communist state. So it's a case here of, is communism always bad? Well, no, not necessarily in this sense. Because what the U.S. can do is it can embarrass Joseph Stalin. Because Tito is still there. You shook your little finger and he's still there. And Yugoslavia is going to become, in essence, a somewhat quasi-independent communist state. Remember the 1980s? Remember the Yugo? The Yugo, there was that unfortunate soul, I think it was Mackinac, she was driving across the big bridge in her Yugo. The Yugo was like about this long, maybe like this tall, including the wheels off the ground. And a big gust of wind came and blew the car right off into the big sploosh, and she died. Okay? shouldn't be driving the Yugos, I guess, in that state. Do you remember there's this small compact car was awful? Well, that came from Yugoslavia. Because the United States here is going to be importing those. But this was a way, in a very indirect fashion, of taking jabs at the Soviet Union. So in terms of it always being ideology, it was something different. Vladislav Gomulka, who is also here the leader of Poland, from his standpoint, he was looking for an opportunity because you have three large Eastern Bloc nations. You've got Poland, you have Hungary, you have Czechoslovakia at this time. And what they're all looking for, because none of them wanted to be dominated by the Soviet Union, absolutely not. And this was true, all these are communist leaders, they all wanted their independent state, including East Germany. But how to go from point A to point B, that became the issue. Gomulka here, as the communist leader of Poland, is watching and monitoring matters very, very closely. In 1953, what happens here is Joseph Stalin dies. He dies, finally, as far as many Soviets were concerned. Comrade Stalin is no longer there. And what happens a few years later is his replacement, Nikita Khrushchev. Nikita Khrushchev is going to give here before the Communist Central Committee in Moscow, he is going to deliver here a 9.5-hour speech. Think about it. You guys sit and listen to me drone on for 60 minutes. Picture me for 9.5 hours. Oh, that'd be fun. Well, in this case here, what Khrushchev is going to be doing before the Central Committee is something that everybody knew about. Everybody knew full well. And that is that Joseph Stalin was responsible for forced collectivization and these great purges that took the lives of millions of Soviet people, this artificial famine in Ukraine, where over 3 million Ukrainians starved to death, what's known as the Holodomor, a complete and total thug. The Soviet Union wasn't prepared for World War II and suffered mightily because of this at the hands of the German Wehrmacht. And that Stalin would go off on these doctors' plot. He was planning to go after the physicians here in 1953 of the Soviet Union, believing they were out to get him. They were enemies of the state. And finally he dies before Pravda, who had announced this doctor's plot, little translation of the Soviet newspaper, The Truth. Well, in this case here, Pravda is talking about this conspiracy of doctors. Stalin dies, it's the end of it. And Nikita Khrushchev is going to deliver this secret speech it's not supposed to get out, but it gets out. It gets out, and it starts to seep across Eastern Europe, Western Europe, into the United States as well. It began this de-Stalinization movement in the Soviet Union that Stalin became, for all intents and purposes, he became this non-person, this non-entity. His name is taken out of all the history books. He had been buried next to Lenin here on public display, which Lenin still is in the present day in Red Square in Moscow. But his body would be taken in the dead of night and buried beneath the Kremlin wall, etc. And the crimes would be brought here to the surface. And he was a disaster for all intents and purposes. There's no doubt about that. Well, from the standpoint of the Eisenhower administration, they learn about this secret speech. They learn here about this secret speech, and they start thinking with this Nikita Khrushchev that maybe he might be something different, very, very different. And for Eisenhower, recognizing the fact that the United States and the Soviet Union have enough in their respective nuclear arsenals to blow up every inch of the planet at least a couple of times over in 1956, it would make a lot more sense if the two nations could sit down and figure out some way of bringing about arms reductions. As Eisenhower would say in these cabinet meetings, how many times can you kill a man? This is out of control, this arms race. It's difficult for us, and I can guarantee you if it's difficult for us, it's 10 times more difficult for the Soviets to keep up in this arms race. So the hope here on the part of Dwight Eisenhower is that in his second term in office, which will easily be reelected, defeating Adlai Stevenson again in '56, that he may be able to bring about or come off here with some sort of serious arms reductions. A thaw, perhaps, in the Cold War, if that was at all possible. By the same time, the two great imperial powers from the 19th century, Britain and France, are in this process of decolonization. And what's happening here is that the Americans are watching this very, very close. Because for a lot of these former colonies of Britain, of France, there is an attraction here of communism. That for the third world nations, China and Mao Zedong are very prominent sponsors here of this. And in this situation, the British, they're going to take their crown jewel, they will partition here into a two-state solution. India and Pakistan in 1947, oh dear God, it was a complete mess. In the aftermath here, you're going to have these two entities. If you're a Muslim living in Muslim Pakistan, you're fine. Or if you're a Hindu living in India, you're fine. But if you're a Hindu living in Pakistan, look out. If you're a Muslim living in India, look out. And in the transition in 1947, over 1 million people are going to die. These two nations end up absolutely despising one another, up to and including the present day. Well, from the standpoint here of Britain, in some cases they would hold on to their colonies if they were still profitable and the relationship was still good. The vast majority of cases here in the 1950s, they are moving to disengage here for the better part of the entire empire. France. From the standpoint of France under Charles de Gaulle, the French here are looking to establish not so much or continue a French empire, but they're looking to continue, in essence, a French Union, as it's referred to as. And from the perspective here of the Americans, who are very closely tied with both Britain and France, two of their best allies, they're watching matters as they in fact formally unfold. Well, for the British, their crown jewel was India. For the French, they had French Indochina going back to 1880, back to this time period here of 1880. And Vietnam, in particular in French Indochina, which was actually made up of three entities, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, Vietnam was like the crown jewel of crown jewels. The French here were taking a great deal, especially rubber, Michelin, and the rubber plantations across Vietnam. Holy mackerel, in the early 20th century, especially as the automobile industry is really starting to take off, is going to just make a huge killing in this nation, or in this entity here, the wealthiest part of all of French Indochina, one of the wealthiest parts of the entire empire, Vietnam. Well, here in French Indochina, it had been a colony since 1880. It wants its independence. And a prominent Vietnamese nationalist, a gentleman by the name of Ho Chi Minh, his outlook here was that the Vietnamese need to rise up in the aftermath of World War II because the French aren't leaving, because it's still a profitable colony, a very profitable colony at that, and throw off this yoke here of French oppression, and become, for all intents and purposes, this independent entity, an independent entity. Now, Ho Chi Minh is a Vietnamese nationalist. His hero, Thomas Jefferson. And what he loved about Thomas Jefferson is the Declaration of Independence and the statement here of all men are created equal. And from Ho Chi Minh's perspective, if there was one nation that would understand what it's like to be a colony used and abused by the European powers, the United States was it. They've been used to the nth degree by the British over the course of the 1700s. Well, here in World War II, the OSS, which is a forerunner to the CIA from the United States, they would finance here Ho Chi Minh and his Viet Minh, this nationalist movement that was struggling against the Japanese, because the Japanese were moving in and trying to take control of this French colony here because it was wealthy, had a great deal of potential, and in fact they would succeed in February of 1945. Well, the OSS here is going to arm, it is going to supply Ho Chi Minh and his Vietnamese in their struggle against the Japanese here at the end of World War II. Well, the Japanese, of course, are formally defeated. September 2nd, 1945, World War II comes to an end. And at this gathering here, an American delegation from the OSS, who knew Ho Chi Minh very, very well, they had also done their research and they found out that he was a Moscow-trained communist. And they said to Ho Chi Minh, straight out here in September of 1945, they said, Ho, are you a communist? To which Ho Chi Minh responded, yes, I am, but can we still be friends? The situation here, history could have been very, very different in many, many ways. The problem fundamentally is that Ho Chi Minh here is a communist. He is a nationalist, first and foremost, but he is also a communist. And what he wants here is he wants for Vietnam to become this independent nation, free of French control. Free of French control. The French under Charles de Gaulle, they're not leaving. They're not leaving, absolutely not. Not in any way, shape, or form. Not this crown jewel, no way, absolutely not going to happen. So what the Viet Minh will do is they're going to here start arming themselves, and they're not going to take on the French military, which will be sent in by the tens of thousands here into Vietnam. They're not going to take them out in the open field, because they know full well they can't succeed. There's no way here they in fact can succeed. They're going to get annihilated. The French army is light years better. But what you're going to do instead is you're going to dress in civilian clothing, and you're going to hit, you're going to run, you're going to hit, you're going to run, you're going to hit, you're going to run. As far as the French are concerned, this is terrorism. This is terrorism, plain and simple. One man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. Not only that, are you going to launch these strikes and then you disappear. Strike, run, hit, run, etc. You are also going to wait till the dark of night, and you're going to pull here the French military into the jungles, where the Vietnamese know here the terrain far better. It's more of a level playing field in this situation. And the attitude on the part of Ho Chi Minh and his Vietnamese nationalists and communists, as far as they are concerned, sooner or later, France is going to tire of this, and they will disengage. It may take 5 years, it may take 10 years, however long. Vietnam here will have its independence. It will have here its independence. Well, what happens is the United States starts financing this war in Vietnam. In 1948, the Truman administration is literally paying for 40% of the war costs for Vietnam, I should say for Vietnam, in Vietnam rather, for the French in Vietnam. 40%. By the time we get to 1953, the United States is financing 80% of the French war effort here in Vietnam. The issue here is you don't want a communist government coming to power. It's not just the Truman Doctrine, it is also in essence here the domino theory. If we lose Vietnam, we're going to lose Thailand, we're going to lose Burma, we could lose India, we could lose Japan. Where does it end? We have to make a stand here in Southeast Asia. Well, the French will be defeated at Dien Bien Phu here in 1954. Dien Bien Phu in 1954. And Dien Bien Phu is way up in the yellow, is all that's all Vietnam. On the far left, you can see here, practically on the border with Laos. And what happens here following the French defeat at Dien Bien Phu is the French realize they have no choice, and the American government here under Dwight Eisenhower is telling them as much. They have no choice but to sit down and work out some sort of way of disengaging, some sort of level of independence here for Vietnam. And what will happen a short time later, in 1954, the French will agree. And France, Britain, the Soviet Union, China, Ho Chi Minh and his Viet Minh, Bao Dai, who's a supporter here of France, he's a Vietnamese nationalist in the southern part of Vietnam. They will all descend on Geneva, Switzerland, and it's going to be strikingly similar to Korea. You're going to partition here Vietnam along the 17th parallel, going right across the middle. Remember Korea? 38th parallel, communist North Korea, capitalist South Korea. Here, we've got the 17th parallel, communist North Vietnam, capitalist South Vietnam. And in this situation, the United States, here is Dwight Eisenhower, along with John Foster Dulles. They are going to have here No Sin Sim. He's going to be overseeing here. He's a staunch Catholic who spent a good deal of time at the Maryknoll Seminary in Baltimore, Maryland, a Vietnamese nationalist as well. He is going to oversee here South Vietnam, this capitalist state. The United States' involvement here in the Cold War is going to effectively begin. Oh, they're not sending in ground forces. Dwight Eisenhower? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Under no circumstances. In closing this evening, Matthew Ridgway, who we had talked about in the Korean War, he's really the hero of the Korean War. Matthew Ridgway is going to do a study in terms of sending American ground forces because South Vietnam seems incredibly unstable. And Ridgway concludes here in 1959, and he tells Dwight Eisenhower this as well, that If you introduce American ground forces to Vietnam, you're making a huge mistake. To South Vietnam, you're making a cataclysmic error. Because it would take at least 500,000 American soldiers, probably, Matthew Ridgway said, probably more like 1 million American soldiers, and it's not going to have much of any impact. It must be avoided entirely. Well, as far as Eisenhower is concerned, couldn't agree more. We're not going to have here in South Vietnam, we're not going to have another Korea. Not in any way, shape, or form. Nevertheless, the American involvement here with this Truman Doctrine, with the domino theory, and I'm not saying it should, I'm not saying it shouldn't. The Americans are getting themselves here more deeply embedded, and they're going to start pouring in even more and more and more and more American money to South Vietnam, to Ngo Dinh Diem. By the same token here, they're going to start sending in the Kennedy administration military advisors, Green Berets. And it's going to be a slow, gradual process here for the Cold War and the American experience. More next time. Thank you so very much. Thank you. Any questions at all? Yes, sir.
Is it true that Ho Chi Minh once lived in New York?
I think he was in New York City for a while. Yes, he was in New York City. He was in Paris for the better part of his time. At the age of 19, he boarded a French ship, and he was working as a cook on board the ships for a good long time. He was in New York City. He was in